Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents James Joyce, A Very Short Introduction, by Colin Maccabe. Narrated by Stewart. Chapter 1. A publication in post-First World War Paris. In the evening of the 1st of February 1922, the printer, Maurice Dorantière, approached the railway station in Dijon with a packet containing 2 copies of the book that he had finished printing the day before. He had originally suggested that he would put the copies straight in the express post, which would be in Paris the next day. However, the author was extraordinarily superstitious and had become convinced that the book's success was dependent on it being published on his birthday, Candlemas Day. He urged the publisher to find a more secure method. The resourceful printer came up with another stratagem. He would entrust the books to the conductor of the newly inaugurated Train Bleu night train, which would reach Paris in the morning, where they could be picked up by the publisher. The train reached Paris at 7 a.m., and Sylvia Beach, the young American bookseller who was publishing her first book, was there to meet it. She rushed to the author's flat and presented him with his 40th birthday present. Then she rushed to her bookshop, Shakespeare & Company, and displayed the second copy in the window. The book was Ulysses, the author James Joyce, and its publication was, for the English language, the major literary event of the 20th century. In 1922, James Joyce occupied an unprecedented position in world letters. He was so famous that even Winston Churchill had subscribed for the deluxe limited first edition of Ulysses. Perhaps more pertinently, both Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot held him to be the greatest master of prose fiction writing in English. He had already attracted generous support, both public — the British state had granted him a pension at the urging of W.B. Yeats — and private. A Rockefeller daughter had gifted him considerable sums. Even more significant, a leftist feminist called Harriet Shaw Weaver had decided that she would devote most of her considerable fortune to supporting the man she considered to be the most important contemporary English writer, perhaps the crucial figure in the revolution that was at hand. However, this world-famous figure had few readers. The most important reason for this was the very widespread desire to destroy his writings before they could be read. Several chapters of Ulysses had been destroyed by officials charged with extirpating anarchist subversion in the United States. More personally, the longest and most difficult chapter of Ulysses, Circe, had been thrown into a fire by an irate husband who started reading what his wife was engaged in typing up as fair copy. But perhaps the incident which best captures the fear and loathing that Joyce's writing produced occurred in 1912, when a Dublin printer was so offended by Joyce's portrait of their native city that he preferred to pulp the volumes of Dubliners he had printed rather than allow their author to buy them from him. This marked the low point of Joyce's literary fortunes. He had completed the collection of 12 short stories in 1905, at the young age of 23, and they had been accepted for publication. However, when he added 2 new stories, one of them, 2 Gallants, so offended both publisher and printer, and under English law both publisher and printer were liable for publishing obscene material, that they refused to set it in type. When Joyce rather unwisely pointed out that many of the other stories were much worse, he set in train a correspondence both farcical and horrific, in which more and more cuts were demanded of him, and this ended, after 4 years, with the English publisher reneging on his agreement. It was a subsequent agreement with a new Irish publisher, which came to an end with the outraged printer preferring to forego any income for his endeavours in favour of the pleasure of informing the author that he was going to pulp all the copies of his immoral and unpatriotic book. When faced with this heartbreaking conclusion to 7 years of trying to get his short stories published, Joyce left Dublin for good. The theme of exile is central to much of Joyce's work. It provides one of the emphases of the closing pages of A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. I will tell you what I will do and what I will not do. I I will not serve that in which I no longer believe, whether it calls itself my home, my fatherland, or my church. And I will try to express myself in some mode of life or art as freely as I can and as wholly as I can, using for my defence the only arms I allow myself to use: silence, exile, and cunning. These words, which are set in 1902, were not written until more than 10 years later, when Joyce had indeed decided to leave his country for good. But his original exile in Paris, the culmination of the final section of A Portrait, ended after a few months with a telegram: "Mother dying, come home. Father." In the 1984 Gabler edition of Ulysses, this line is printed as "Nother dying, come home, father." To adopt this reading is to accept that Joyce's obsessive checking of proofs did not extend to one of the most important lines in the text. This first return to Ireland provided the subject matter for Ulysses, set in the 16th of June 1904, the day on which his life was joined to Nora Barnacle, who would be his life companion, and with whom he would leave Dublin in the autumn of that year. Many commentators take the fictional Stephen Dedalus at his word, and see Joyce determined on the spiritual condition of exile from very early on. However, when he left Dublin in 1904, his exile was propelled by much more temporal considerations, and was by no means as definitive as it became in retrospect. Exile has been the condition of the majority of Irish men and women for over 2 centuries, as they have fled poverty and hunger to find work across the globe. Joyce was merely joining his countrymen when, unable to earn a living in Dublin, he set out to find work as a language teacher in Europe. He was much more individual, however, in that this economic imperative was intensified by questions of sexuality. Joyce's rejection of the Catholic Church, in which he had been reared, was so visceral that on his return from Paris he refused his dying mother's entreaties to kneel and pray at her deathbed. When he determined to spend his life with the young woman from Galway, who had made out with such enthusiasm on the 16th of June, he had no intention of marrying her with the blessing of either church or state. As he wrote later to his brother, Stanislas, "I cannot tell you how strange I feel sometimes in my attempt to live a more civilized life than my contemporaries. But why should I have brought Nora to a priest or lawyer to make her swear away her life to me?" But there was no question of Joyce living in Dublin with a woman to whom he was not married. It posed intermittent difficulties on the continent. It would have been impossible in Catholic Ireland. However, Joyce did think of moving back to Ireland in his early years in Trieste, where he worked at the Berlitz School, and his permanent exile was a state which was reached gradually. The overwhelming hostility which greeted his desperate attempts to publish Dubliners in Ireland in 1912 marked the final break with his homeland. But perhaps the most important symbolic moment had come on a visit he made 3 years earlier. He had come back to Dublin in the summer of 1909, both to secure an Irish publisher for Dubliners, and also to see if there was any possibility of a professorship at his old university. But the visit was overwhelmed by a meeting with his old friend Cosgrave, who appears under the name of Lynch in both A Portrait and Ulysses. Cosgrave told Joyce that in the summer of 1904, as Joyce was pledging his life to Nora, Nora was also granting Cosgrave sexual favours. Joyce suffered a complete nervous collapse, which is recorded vividly by his friend Byrne, Cranley, in A Portrait. Byrne took Joyce to the house that he was living in, at No. 7 Eccles Street, and spent a whole afternoon convincing Joyce that Cosgrave's account was the product of spite and bitterness at the success that Joyce had made of his life with Nora, and contained not one shred of truth. It is a testament to the importance of this moment in Joyce's psychic life that No. 7 Eccles Street appears in Ulysses as the house in which Leopold and Molly Bloom live, and it is to that house that Leopold escorts Stephen Dedalus at the end of their long Dublin day. Joyce never forgot the shock of believing himself cuckolded, and spent the rest of his life trying to write his way out of that masculine desire for possession of the female body, which he analyses in Ulysses as a part of the new forms of property inaugurated by capitalism. Crucial to this rewriting was the explosion of epistolary phone sex between Joyce and Nora, occasioned by Joyce's initial belief in Cosgrave's claims. To read these letters between Trieste and Dublin in the summer of 1909 is to engage with a raw sexuality, which Joyce will use as basic material for much of both the Circe and Penelope chapters of Ulysses. It is also to recognise a third reason why Joyce had to leave Dublin in 1904. He may have been disciplined to marry Nora Barnacle for ideological reasons, but he would have found it more than difficult to marry her for social reasons in a Dublin still governed by Victorian morality. It is often remarked that it is difficult to marry across boundaries of race or nation. It is less often emphasised that to marry across class barriers is even more difficult. Joyce's parents belonged to the Irish Catholic middle class, who had gained civil emancipation in 1829, but who were to be caught up in the struggle for political independence throughout the rest of the century. The struggle for Home Rule was to dominate Joyce's youth, but the First World War saw violent revolution take the stage in 1916, and, after revolution and civil war, the establishment of the Irish Free State. His father, John Stanislaus Joyce, an active participant in the Parnellite stage of this struggle in the 1880s, was a drunk and a wastrel who frittered away a substantial inheritance, and the family had lived in ever-increasing poverty since Joyce was 10, a shift marked in A Portrait by the move from the middle-class suburbs of South Dublin to the slums north of the Liffey, and in Life by Joyce's move from an expensive boarding school, Clongowes, to a subsidised day school place at Belvedere. But if the family moved irreversibly down the objective social ladder, John Stanislaus Joyce clung ever more fiercely to his imaginary social status. No son of his would marry a chambermaid at Finn's Hotel, who had been brought up by her grandmother in Galway. It was for this reason Joyce hid from his father that he was eloping with Nora when they took ship in the autumn of 1904, and indeed, it was 5 years more before John Stanislaus Joyce was reconciled to his son's choice of lifelong companion. If Nora failed to measure up to notions of Victorian middle-class womanhood, she had been spared that extreme repression of the female body, which was the Victorians' most astonishing contribution to civilization. One cannot imagine the well-brought-up young Sheehy girls, who were from Joyce's own class, and one of whom provided the model for Miss Ivors in the final story of Dubliners, The Dead, reacting very positively to a letter which evoked rank red cunt. Nora, however, replied in kind. After 1909, Joyce talked no more of returning permanently to Ireland, but it was the horrendous visit of 1912 which rendered exile irreversible. It is difficult to read the account of Joyce's final, desperate efforts at that time to get his book of short stories published without suffering on the young author's behalf. When the publisher, Roberts, who had played with Joyce like a cat with a mouse, delivered the final legal opinion that the whole book was libelous, Joyce wrote to Nora, "I read it and walk down the street feeling the whole future of my life slipping out of my grasp." It was not just his publisher who had turned against him. His old friend, Thomas Kettle, now a member of Parliament, said that he thought the book would do harm to Ireland, and in a final twist of the knife, his own solicitor turned against him. At 23, when he had submitted the original manuscript, he had been one of the most promising young authors in Ireland. At 30, he looked as though he was finished. He was certainly finished with Ireland. The next year his luck finally changed. Grant Richards, who had been the original English publisher, asked to reconsider the book, and Dubliners was finally published to respectful reviews and no scandal in June 1914. The publication of Dubliners allowed Joyce to take up again A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, an autobiographical account of his young life in Dublin, on which he had been working since 1904, but which the endless difficulties with Dubliners had left stalled at the 3rd chapter. The impetus to finish the book, and finish quickly, came from Ezra Pound. Pound, an American who had been in London since 1908, had made himself the entrepreneurial and ideological chief of a one-man revolution to modernise both his and others' writing in order to transform the world. England was at the height of its political and economic power, and also at the end of its empire. Ireland was the most destabilising force in British life, and Pound's first major intervention was to teach the former member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, W.B. Yeats, to abandon the diction and manner of his Gaelic twilight poetry and to write in modern English. It was this modernised Yeats who was to become the poet of the Irish Revolution, the author of Easter, 1916, and Meditations in Time of Civil War. It was Yeats who alerted Pound to Joyce. If you were looking for fault lines in the collapse of the Victorian Empire, Ireland was one. Women were another. Pound was both a womanizer and a sexist, but before either of those, he was a critic, desperate for outlets for the new writing that he was discovering. One editor, who shared his literary aims, was Dora Marsden, who had been a major player in the terrorist stage of the suffragette struggle. She had finally found the suffragettes too limited in their revolutionary aims, and had set up a magazine called The Free Woman, which placed its revolutionary hopes in a new writing that was going to blast the old, false writing, which would stop war and allow same-sex love, the writing that would usher in the revolution. When The Free Woman started its long fight with English printers to publish A Portrait of the Artist, it had changed its name to The Egoist, after a brief spell as The New Free Woman, and was effectively edited by Harriet Shaw Weaver, who was to transform Joyce's life. Unlike almost all the other women who dedicated their lives to publishing Joyce, Harriet Shaw Weaver was not a flamboyant lesbian. She was often taken by the ordinariness of her dress to be a Quaker, but she had been reared in a Church of England vicarage. She had become both a feminist and a leftist. Indeed, she would finally join the Communist Party in 1938, the year before Joyce published Finnegans Wake. History relates only one love in Harriet Shaw Weaver's life. As she published A Portrait, chapter by chapter, she fell ecstatically in love with Joyce's writing. This was the greatest of writing. This was the new world, glimpsed. Harriet Shaw Weaver was also, on her mother's side, a very considerable heiress, and she determined that her contribution to the revolution would be to use her inheritance to allow Joyce to write as he pleased. In the end, A Portrait could not be printed in London as a book, but she imported copies from the United States. However, A Portrait was decorous compared to Ulysses. Grown men dropped their printing tools when they read snot green and scrotum tightening as new adjectives for the sea in the first chapter. By the time Joyce reached chapter 15, where the book's narrative climaxes in a brothel, our hero would change gender, and the printers would have to be revived with smelling salts. More titillating, if less radical, the last chapter, number 18, would be the semi-erotic reveries of a woman dozing next to her husband, he having visited a brothel that evening, and she having committed adultery that afternoon. There could be no question of publishing Ulysses in England. No printer would touch it. America, however, was more promising. The weight of censorship did not fall on printers, and, in any case, there were scores of anarchist printers who would set anything that would blow the rotten system sky high. The American equivalent of The Egoist was The Little Review, which was edited by two lesbians who had formed many of their ideas in the melting pot of feminism and anarchism. One of them, Jane Heap, is claimed by some to have written the first public defence of same-sex relationships. Both Heap and her lover, Margaret Anderson, were not fazed by the threat of imprisonment. They were happy to be imprisoned for the cause, and determined, at whatever cost, to see Ulysses published. It is certain that the US authorities would have prosecuted chapter 15 of the novel, which is set in a brothel, but they didn't have to wait. Each chapter was being published in serial form, with a title, the episode in the Odyssey to which it corresponded. Chapter 13 had the title Nausicaa. The Nausicaa episode in the Odyssey reveals to us a beautiful young princess who has gone down to the sea with her attendants to launder bedding. Homer paints an erotic picture of an overexcited young virgin princess playing with her attendants when she is overwhelmed by the sight of the naked Odysseus arising out of the sea. The episode is one of the Western paradigms of the phallic warrior, the very idea which had just destroyed Europe. Joyce's version is less heroic. The chapter culminates with a beautiful young girl, her head full of romance, flashing her knickers at our hero, who takes the golden opportunity to furtively masturbate. The United States may have ignored the printers, but it was because they had developed a much more draconian system of censorship, which concentrated on the distribution of obscene material through the post. The very real threat of anarchism in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, combined with long-standing committees for the suppression of vice, meant that censorship in the United States was terrifying in its reach and power. Nausicaa didn't stand a chance. John Quinn, Joyce's lawyer, kept Heap and Anderson, rather to their chagrin, out of jail, but Nausicaa was banned, and with it any chance of Ulysses being published in uncensored form in either America or England. It was Dublin in 1912 all over again, but now Joyce was in Paris and had a young bookseller who worshipped Joyce's writing. Sylvia Beach would add publishing to her bookshop's many activities, and the book would be published in Paris, the world centre of dirty books. Production is one thing, distribution is another. The incredible stories of how many people risked prison to get Ulysses into both Britain and America is witness to how a book marketed to aesthetes was distributed by political believers. Ulysses was launched as a revolutionary text, and it was to retain some of this aura for many decades. Joyce himself made no political pronouncements of any kind after he fled Trieste at the beginning of the First World War, but his social world in Paris was that of the fellow travelling left. The last 2 decades in Paris are unbearably sad. He was acknowledged as one of the most important writers in the world, and Harriet Shaw Weaver's generosity meant that he lived like a rich man, with endless expensive holidays, and Nora dressed in furs. His new project, which had the working title Work in Progress, was finally published in book form as Finnegans Wake by T.S. Eliot at Faber and Faber in 1939. He was undoubtedly the most influential writer in English of the 20th century. Eliot acknowledged Ulysses as having provided the method and inspiration for his great poem, The Waste Land, and although Virginia Woolf and William Faulkner were less frank about their debts, both Mrs. Dalloway in 1925 and The Sound and the Fury in 1929 are clearly written in direct imitation of the opening chapters of Ulysses. But Joyce could not really enjoy his years of fame, for they were also years of growing blindness. He was plagued with constant attacks of iritis. The first had come in Trieste in 1907, and the second in Zurich in 1917. But in Paris, there are operations and consultations every year, if not every month. He was to lose almost all sight in one eye, and needed a magnifying glass to write. But there was worse to come. He was not only to experience the fading of physical light. His daughter, Lucia, whose very name meant light, was to dissolve into madness during the 1930s. Joyce consulted psychiatrist after psychiatrist, determined to convince them that his daughter's developing psychosis was simply experiments in language, similar to those he was conducting in his own writing. It was the Swiss psychoanalyst Jung who delivered the most tragic judgment on this argument, when he told the great author that he was diving, but his daughter was drowning. Nothing, however, would stop Joyce writing. Through blindness and madness, through the political turmoil of the 1930s, as Europe prepared for the second part of its fatal civil war, Joyce continued his most experimental work. There was this time no difficulty in getting his writing published, either in installments or in its final book form. In fact, Finnegans Wake is even more polymorphously perverse than Ulysses. However, it is written in an experimental language, and the most complicated of narrative structures, so that it needs to be studied at length to reveal its unspeakable sexual truths. Joyce's last book remains one of the great literary enigmas. It is an irredeemably private work, a record of Joyce's own access to language and consciousness in the Dublin of the 1880s. Or is it, as he intended, a guide to the transformations and substitutions that constitute all of our dreaming minds? The jury is still out. Finnegans Wake was published just before the outbreak of the Second World War, and soon, for the second time in their lives, Joyce and Nora had to flee war and find refuge in neutral Zurich, the city where they had consummated their love in 1904. But now they were not the young lovers of that year, nor the energetic family which had fled Trieste in 1915. Joyce was old beyond his years, and his gargantuan abuse of alcohol was to take its final toll when a stomach ulcer perforated, and he died on the 13th of January 1941. There is no doubt that he is the greatest of all Irish writers. It is my opinion that he is the greatest of writers in English since Shakespeare. It is also the case that his writing deliberately attempts to undo the whole tradition of English literature, stretching back to Beowulf. Joyce, however, is not like other writers of the Gaelic revival, seeking in the past a pure Irish language and pure Irish bodies. All of Joyce's writing is a celebration of impurity, of what Finnegans Wake calls miscegenations on miscegenations. Joyce's writing was intended above all as a contribution to a future which would not be paralysed and butchered by masculinity. His contribution has still to be fully measured. Chapter 2. Dubliners. The end of the 19th century saw a massive increase in newspaper publication, as the increasingly literate populations of the industrialised countries provided a huge market for a wide range of popular papers. One result of this development was an ever-increasing demand for short stories to leaven the news reporting, which provided the majority of the content for this new form of newspaper. So valuable were these short stories in an ever more competitive marketplace that they provided very significant earnings for writers as diverse as Kipling, Chekhov, and de Maupassant. Joyce, too, earned his first fee for fiction from one of these new media, but the Irish Homestead was not a mass tabloid publication, and the fee which Joyce joyfully pocketed was a mere £1. The Irish Homestead had been founded in 1895 as the paper of the Irish Cooperative Society, which promoted improvements in Irish agriculture through various forms of cooperative organisation. One of the leaders of this movement was George Russell, A.E. in Ulysses, who combined this commitment to agriculture with a devotion to theosophy and a fierce loyalty to literature. Although he did not become editor of the Irish Homestead until 1905, he seems to have acted as an informal editor for fiction, and it was in that role that he wrote to Joyce, having read and been impressed by some of the opening chapters of Stephen Hero, the autobiographical novel that Joyce was now engaged in writing. He knew that Joyce was desperate for money, which would prove a lifelong condition, and suggested that he might write a short story for the Irish Homestead, which would be simple, rural, live-making, pathos. He added that the story should not shock the Homestead's readers, and that the paper would pay him £1. It is easily earned money, if you can write fluently and don't mind playing to the common understanding and liking, for once, in a way. You can sign it any name you like as a pseudonym. Joyce referred scathingly to the Irish Homestead in Ulysses as the Pigs paper, but he leapt at the opportunity that Russell so generously offered. Nor did his choice of pseudonym, Stephen Daedalus, suggest he was distancing himself from the story, for this was the name that was already fully established as his fictional alter ego in the autobiographical novel which had impressed Russell. The story that he submitted was The Sisters. It did not fit Russell's instructions to play to the common understanding and liking. Still less was it simple or rural. But it was a paid-for publication, and Joyce immediately announced that it was the first of a series of 10 stories. I call the series Dubliners, to portray the soul of that hemiplegia or paralysis that many consider a city. If the Irish homestead crystallised the idea of a collection of stories which would take the city of Dublin as its subject.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?